I'm excited to have the privilege today to sit down here with Spencer Kimball, the founder of Cockroach Labs, original creator of GIMP, which he authored while he was still in college, co-creator. He went to Google after that, was the CTO of Viewfinder. Maybe we'll hear a little bit about that during today's chat, before he started Cockroach Labs in 2014? 2015, which is a cloud-native distributed SQL database that many of you have used, heard of for sure, and are excited to hear about the early days of how he got started. We're at South Park Commons, which is a community for folks navigating what we call the -1 to 0 in the founder journey. And in the spirit of that, I thought it would be good to start all the way back. Before you were CEO, founder of Cockroach Labs, tell us a little bit about kind of your career up until that point, how you first decided to become an entrepreneur and what that was like.
Sure. I mean, if you go all the way back, I started programming when I was 12, I mean, in terms of my career. I never really got off the computer. That original one was the TI-99 4A. So it was, you had to save your programs onto a cassette tape. It's pretty cool. But I never was without a project my entire life until I became a CEO. And then the project is the company, I guess. But it took some number of years at Cockroach to let go of the programming desire and the sense of purpose it always gave me. So, see, after university, I took a couple jobs you didn't mention that didn't last very long, and that led me to the entrepreneurial track. I had a brief stint at Anderson Consulting, which is now Accenture, and I thought it'd be cool to travel around and be a consultant, like live in other cities and things after being a student. And it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. I got put on like some PeopleSoft project, and I had to help these very long established employees move off I think it was a VAX system onto some newer form of Unix. And yeah, it was a far cry from all the projects I'd been working on. I felt like my time was wasted. So then I thought I'd be an investment banker. So I went and did this boutique investment bank for a little bit of time. Ironically, it was with collateralized mortgage obligations, which blew up in 2008. But this was back in '98, so I don't know if I had too much to do with it. And then I lasted about a year there, and the dot-com boom was in full swing, so I headed to do a startup, and I was a co-CTO of that startup. This is before Viewfinder, before Google. So this is '99 to 2001. And that company got sold, not for much of anything, but it was quite an experience. I was sort of a junior partner, really still fresh out of school, and worked with a Harvard MBA who was the CEO. We raised money, we grew the company. Dot-com bust happened, managed to sell it, but that was a good learning experience. I went from 101 in California being a parking lot to, I swear, it felt like tumbleweed was going to cross 101 after the dot-com bust happened. So we think about these corrections that have happened more recently, the financial crisis and the more recent downturn, and that, I think something like 90-something% of all the value in tech was wiped out overnight. So it was really an incredible adjustment. So the whole Bay Area went from the center of the universe to hard to find any pulse. It felt like a corpse. But Google was doing okay. And I have my co-founder now, who actually I went to university with at Berkeley. We wrote the GIMP together. He actually was already at Google for 3 months, and he was telling me, hey, you need to come here. This place is amazing. They're making money. We both did dot-com startups, both failed. And Google was succeeding where others were out of business. Webvan and Pets.com, all those things were wiped out. Google was surging, and that was a rare bright spot. So I went to Google 10 years and was a software engineer there, moved to New York when they opened an office here. I was very eager to trade a smaller city, San Francisco, for New York City. It seemed like a more interesting place to be, and still in my 20s. And Google was starting an engineering office to capitalize on Bell Labs, shedding a whole bunch of great engineers. And so they moved in and started hiring. And that was, I guess, 8 years of the decade that I was at Google in New York. I saw the office go from a handful of engineers to, I think they ended with 6,000, 8,000, something like that. And Google had 35,000 people at that point. So it was quite a journey. It was super exciting. But I'll tell you what happened to me. and brought me back to the entrepreneur track. I was very happy at Google, maybe too happy, kind of got a little bit lazy. Some days I was killing it, some days I was mailing it in. I started having these dreams where there was just this gravestone, and it was rest in peace, a Google software engineer. I was like, wait, is this all I'm going to do my whole life? It's awesome. It was cool projects. I always was on interesting teams and so forth, but I felt like I had to do something else. So I thought maybe I'd go back and be a doctor or get a PhD, or just something else, learn something else. And eventually my friends, again, Peter, who worked on the GIMP with me, and some others, convinced us to do this startup called Viewfinder, which was private photo sharing. And I remember at the time we started, we just didn't like Facebook. We didn't want to put things publicly. That was just our personal predilection. But at the same time we started that, which ultimately didn't succeed, Snapchat was starting. And we looked at Snapchat, which back then was really about sharing images that would disappear for obvious reasons. And we laughed and we thought, what a piece of garbage. Well, it just goes to show, I don't think our forte was consumer apps. So we ended up in the process of building Viewfinder, thinking of the idea of Cockroach. And so we did an acqui-hire with Square, which is a great place to land. Peter and I and Ben, who had joined us, who was also at Google with us, we decided over the course of building Viewfinder and really missing some of the technology that Google had, and then going to Square and realizing they needed this technology as well. Hey, we should build this thing called Cockroach, which we'd already come up with the name back when we first ideated on it.
Oh, wow.
And so that sort of brings us full circle. So there's been 3 entrepreneurial stints in Square and Google as big companies, not to mention Accenture.
That's incredible. I think the thing that was inspiring for me is knowing that your co-founders were people that you'd worked with before. You have multiple startups with one of them, and you
both of them,
and then you were writing code together back at Berkeley. So I guess tell us a little bit. A lot of folks here are in the early parts of potentially finding a co-founder. Tell us about how that process went. Like, how did you know you wanted to go from coworker or friend to co-founder, and what was that process like? Who convinced who?
It wasn't hard. When we met in '93, I remember I actually was in the dorm with Peter's older brother. So I didn't know Peter. Peter was a year younger than me. His older brother was a year older. So I remember James, his brother, said to me, "You program a lot." He was a mechanical engineer. My little brother programs too. He's really good. And I was thinking, nah, I doubt he is. That's just what people, everyone overestimates that. And I thought I was pretty hotshot programmer. And then I met him, and it turns out he was better than I was. And we started immediately ideating. We just hit it off right from the start on the GIMP. We thought, man, there's just not anything good for Unix-based systems that isn't horribly expensive. And Photoshop was available only on Solaris. And Linux was just coming up, FreeBSD, all these things were out there. So we thought, we need the original manifesto, I wish we still had it, was quite a read. It was not supposed to really have much of a graphical user interface. This would be more like NetPBM, and everything could be done through the command line, which honestly would have been pretty cool. But we ended up starting to build it, and once you put your foot on the path of an interesting project, I didn't do much classwork when I was at Google. It was really the GIMP, and I loved every minute of it. So,
wow.
So Ben and Peter and I, we started within like 3 months of each other at Google. Okay. Peter, as I said, convinced me to go. Mm-hmm. Ben showed up fresh out of undergrad, and he got put onto my team, which was called Everything But the Kitchen Sink. So I work on weird project names. It's my history. And Ben was sort of the junior team member at that time, and we started working on, as the name suggests, just a miscellaneous grab bag of things that Google needed, especially in Java. And we worked together for something like 5 years of the 10, and then Ben went on to do other things. Peter and I continue on a project called Colossus, but there was just this on and off project-based work together, and we went through many ups and downs through that process. And that's really, I think, the key test of a good co-founder. Mm-hmm. Do you maintain your respect when things are going well, and also over many years, and where things are not going so well, and there's a lot of stress, because the people that you can count on, mm-hmm. I think after several years of that, you get a pretty good idea. And by the way, by this Google time, when we moved to New York, actually, part of the reason Peter came with me is because I think he had a crush on my sister. So he shows up in New York, and we were living together before we kind of figured out what we wanted to do. So we were sharing an apartment. My sister moves in. That was a bit of a surprise. And they're shacking up together, and that took a bit of adjustment. It was our friendship, the amount of time we spent together went that downhill, and the time they went together went quite far uphill. They got married shortly after. He actually asked me, if that was going to be okay. He's been a great brother-in-law.
Yeah, wow. I wasn't expecting that. So you mentioned that you came up with the idea while working on Viewfinder for Cockroach.
Yes.
That makes it sound like you stopped working on Viewfinder, you just immediately hit the ground running with Cockroach, and things were easy because you knew what you were building, you had the team in place. Tell us, what was it really like? What was the first product? What was the first failure?
Well, so we didn't. It's a little bit more convoluted. I'll try to keep it brief. We came up with the idea of Cockroach. I really did. I was in charge of trying to build the back end for this new Viewfinder thing. So think of a private photo sharing app where you want to handle tons of images. You want to geolocate them. You want to be able to search. Originally, we wanted to use the location features on the phone to make it really easy to find your friends that were near you based on your contact list, and to find your photos and suggest shares and all these things. So we realized we'd need a big database. We'd probably have to worry about geographic locations, because we coming from Google, we were worried about problems that most founders shouldn't worry about, honestly. But we wanted to have a really great scalable database. And honestly, we looked at all the different things that were in the open source world, and we got excited about each in turn. There was React, there was HBase, there was Mongo, there was the Postgres and MySQL, which we had some familiarity with. And ultimately, we came to the conclusion that nothing would really meet all the requirements we had. And so I sat down and I thought about, okay, we're going to have all these commodity pieces of hardware in the cloud. You should be able to throw something in, and it should link up with the other existing nodes in the system, and they should start to share the data. And there's a lot of redundancy, and if something gets killed, everything else continues and rebalances and figures it out. And it just, living in New York, the name suggested itself. But, I got started for about 10 days of mad programming, trying to lay down some of the foundations. I realized, we were going to write it in C++ originally. I'm going to need an RPC networking subsystem. So I started writing that. And I got pretty far on it, but you can't write a database and also build an application on the database at the same time, or you got to choose one or the other. So we ended up, DynamoDB came out at that very moment. So we used DynamoDB, but the problem with those NoSQL systems is the consistency, lack of transactions, and we ended up spending a lot of time not having the database we wanted. So as I said, when we got acquired by Square, which was about 2 years of doing Viewfinder, that was a whole new perspective, which shed light on all the original ideas and why we needed them. Square needed them. We asked people that had left Google, that were at Pinterest and are at Dropbox and at Yelp, what are you doing for databases? Are you having these problems? And everyone said the same thing, which is there was a definite and widespread need, at least in the tech side of the industry, for a database like Cockroach. So after 14 months at Square, they actually let us work on it for quite a bit of time. And that's kind of where the name got cemented, because Jack Dorsey was using the name, and you just realize once that happens, it's locked in. You don't want to forgo the benefit of name recognition at that point. So it was a lot of twists and turns to actually get to the point where we said, let's take the plunge. And ultimately, that came down to having venture capitalists interested.
So you left once you were able to build conviction to raise.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was that first fundraise? I imagine there's a lot of competition, as you mentioned, generally in the database space, but what was that fundraise like?
Well, there is a lot of competition now. Back then, in 2014, when we started building this, the idea of taking the Spanner white paper that Google had created and building an actual open source database off that was not exactly novel, but nobody else was doing it. And we had a design doc, which we published, which was really good. I think that's better than just starting a project, because it's a digestible map of the future state. And people will forgive a lot of question marks in terms of how it's actually going to work in practice if they understand where you're going with the design doc. But that generated so much interest when the GitHub project got started, got a ton of stars. So I don't know what the situation is now. I think these signals change for VCs all the time. But back then, I think we had already 6,000 stars or something like that. And that was like, we'll write you a check. What do you want? And it helped that we were coming from Google and that we'd worked on distributed infrastructure, so they felt the team could execute on the idea. And that's very important too. But the biggest thing, which I've realized over and over again in the 10 years we've been doing Cockroach, is that databases are a very sort of ideal product category if you can succeed with them. And one of the things that venture capitalists are very intent on is how big is the market you're addressing. And people, wave hands and make all kinds of overestimates in general, but databases are legitimately very large and grow every year by double digits. So it's like this compounding annual growth, and it's going to be a multi-$100 billion market by 2030, like a $200 billion market a year. And we address a smallish piece of that, but if you can address $1 billion or even 10 billion, then you have a very long-term business. The other interesting thing about databases is once you can get someone on, which by the way is not easy, they're kind of a high lifetime value customer or account. It's hard for them to move off, and so if the database works well for them, you've got a great annuity in that customer, and so that is, I think, the single greatest aspect of the project and then the company, and it continues to be, because everyone sees, whatever the theory of your business is, whatever kind of customers you're going to have, to the extent you start to succeed, that just means, okay, well, how many more of those kinds of customers are there? How long will they be with you? How much are they going to spend on the database? How much expansion potential? And so if you have a good story on all those things and you can see a future to having a great business, that actually puts you almost as an outlier in everyone that's coming to the, knocking on the VC's doors with a pitch deck.
Yep. That definitely resonates. I think as a founder, as an investor, I think that the vision is so important. Has that changed over time? You've had multiple successful fundraise. Tell us a little bit about. Has that pitch evolved? Has the vision changed?
It certainly has. And the vision of what we were building technically didn't change very much. The big evolution was we'd started with a distributed database, and it was already starting to get somewhat crowded. Mongo is a distributed database. HBase is a distributed database. There was FoundationDB. There were a number of things out there, and it made me start to get nervous about a year in. And I realized with the distributed database, and we had prospects that were asking various questions, there was this opportunity to think about the database spanning continents. And this is a problem that we worried about back at Viewfinder, and of course at Google before that, which is, okay, well, how do you localize the data to customers? And when you have a distributed architecture, that's a problem that's more solvable than obviously a monolithic system that has to sit in one location. So that was something we embraced very early on. And I think that, literally, it's taken till the last couple of years before customers actually have that in production. But it's a remarkably differentiated capability. And there was a lesson that I was warned about, and I think kind of learned, and we got ourselves on the right track to make that really important refinement in what we were building. And that lesson is, if you try to build something that is addressing this massive market, and you imagine that it's going to actually appeal to and land you customers across that whole addressable market with a lot of competitors, that's a tall order. Right? What you really want to do is find your aperture narrowed to a point where you actually are building something really differentiated, but valuable. Like, that's critical. You don't want to just narrow it down to something that nobody really wants. Ultimately, you want to have something that's valuable for really early adopters, but you see that the world's moving in that direction. That's sort of the ideal place to put yourself. And like I said, that was maybe 2016 we started really building that capability, and it took almost 6 years probably to get it working well enough and to get the customer, to get them into production and so forth. So that was a very long journey.
Wow. 6 years. I imagine that you're focused on building product, getting customers. You have your two co-founders, one of whom is now dating your sister. What was like the hardest moment you went through? Were there any days where you kind of just thought, okay, this isn't working, maybe we should stop?
Yes, definitely we had those. Part of our problem, the challenge that we faced is when we started Cockroach, we maybe had 2 people, 3 people, some part-time people contributing to the code base remotely from wherever. Maybe worked 6 months on it at Square. It was still alpha, barely worked, and we had tons of interest from the VCs. You asked about that first round. We got a term sheet from a VC I'd never heard of in New York. The 2 folks that gave it have gone on to really great VC careers, but that really emboldened us, and we started asking around. I'd never raised money before directly, and a lot of people were interested for those reasons. There's just a database, and it looks like a team that could build it. This could be, the next Oracle. So there was a lot of interest, and we went with Sequoia and Benchmark and Google Ventures. So it was a great initial group of investors that participated. However, we had to raise that round, and then we had to raise another round, and then we had to raise a third round before we even really had prospects that could use the database. Wow. So we raised a lot of money and went through various stages, but we didn't look anything like a successful startup should look. Like by the time you raise a Series B, for example, you're supposed to have some customers. They might not be repeatable that you're scaling, but some people should be paying you. You should have a road to some kind of revenue. And we were still begging people to trial a very rough early version of the product because it's a hard thing to build. And we weren't starting with an open source product that had already been built in Google, let's say, and then thrown over the wall. Many open source companies, they have a very, a relatively well evolved and almost somewhat ubiquitous open source product that they're taking to market. We were an open source company that was actually building the product from the start of the company. So that was a very long road, 3 years before we had something that worked to it. When you squinted, it worked. Mm-hmm. And in those 3 years, believe me, because we had not succeeded in our .com startups. We'd had an amazing run at Google. That was lovely. Square did quite well. Viewfinder and the startups we did in the .com days were what we did on our own. Mm-hmm. And our track record wasn't so good. And so you start having these doubts 3 years in. Who's going to ever use this product? What have we been working on? It's been really easy to raise money, but what do we have to show for it? And there was a lot of anxiety related to that because it's a kind of a long way to go out on a shaky limb. At least that's what it felt like. But that is where there's a lesson that I learned, which I keep trying to formulate it so it makes sense, but there's a hierarchy of what's required for any kind of success. And at the bottom, I think there's this belief that it's where all of the real effort goes. It's kind of the sweat equity you put in. Right? That is obviously critical. That's how you get the actual work done. But that has to be guided by an intelligent plan. Right? So you have to apply intelligence to make sure that your efforts are directed to some sort of reasonable strategic outcome. You can't. You win with a strategy by marshaling your forces into a fairly narrow, degree of focus, and with that you can break through whatever your resources are. If there's a lot of them, you can have a wider focus. If you don't have that many, and the critical thing is to find where's the weak spot, where can we break through, right? But the thing that trumps sweat equity and intelligence every time, and without it you will absolutely not succeed, is belief. Right, so that was, if it wasn't for the fact that we had worked at Google, we saw all the reasons that Spanner had to be built, we saw that they needed it at Square, we saw that we needed it even as just developers trying to do this random app, I don't think I could have lasted 3 years. So that belief was based on something, happily. After 2, not very successful startups, to say the least, I needed something kind of superhuman, like a crystal ball to look into the future, which is what Google was fundamentally. Otherwise, I don't think I could have made 3 years with with that storm cloud of doubt hanging over it.
Wow. Was there an inflection point after those 3 years? And was it because you signed a first customer, or you got your product to production?
It was kind of a slowly gathering set of signals. And we had customers or prospects that were very interested early on, that were still interested. We had some that had transitioned into doing POCs, and we had some that signed up and then the database failed on them, and then they churned. That's very difficult to deal with. But it was interestingly enough, the customers that were very early that are still with us, they really have continued to allow us to evolve our strategy. You kind of want to, over that period of time where you start getting those early customers, like that is the most crucial thing. And there's this really strong temptation to want to say, okay, we got some successes here. They're using the product. It seems to be that we can make revenue. Let's get more. Let's scale this up. Let's find the repeatable sales motion. But the reality is you need to be very careful that you study those early customers and that you make the product really work well for them before you try to scale something up. Otherwise, you can learn a lot of the wrong lessons and chase these short-term hits and so forth. And so it is. That's another fundamental lesson we learned. The customers that are still with us, those are the ones that we allowed, and it's always a tension, but we allowed them to help really set our roadmap and to make sure that we were building the product for them. Because if you build in a bubble, in some level of isolation from some really great reference customers, then you really, I see this again and again, because there's aspects of the system, features we add, where we do kind of build in isolation with an anticipation of an unmet need that we see, but we don't have a customer specifically asking for it. Those fail. Like you have to get a great customer that can help you build a product that actually works for what they need. Because if you do it for one, there will be others like that. It's a big world out there. But if you don't do it for anyone specific in mind, you definitely can end up with something that you just have to do a lot of work to get any additional customer to use it and to have it work well for them. So it's best to start that way.
I definitely agree with that. I think a pitfall I sometimes see are founders going straight to, how do we acquire a bunch of users without really identifying a couple of core user types that what you're building really would resonate with. Were there ever any moments where you maybe were directed the wrong way because of customer feedback, or you felt like, or you went down a route that, ended up as a dead end?
All the time.
Yeah.
That's the thing that is almost impossible to avoid if you're trying to scale your revenue before your product's ready. Because you get, especially with a general purpose thing like a database, all kinds of interested prospects. And the way one of our investors describes it is, for early companies, you throw your net into the water and anything you pull up, you're like, let's see if we can eat this weird thing. It's like a sea slug or something. But let's eat it. It might have some potential because they want to use what we have. That sounds great. The problem is that if you're pulling in all these maybes, it's hard to satisfy them all at once, and you get stretched in all these different directions. It's much better to treat that early cohort as the gold ones and be quite selective. It doesn't mean you don't pull in that net. Of course you do, right? But eventually you want to get to the point, it depends on the product, but for ours at least, you want to get to the point where you're extremely selective and you're hunting for a very specific ideal customer profile. That is a much better way to scale the business. But there's another thing that is worth calling out because it's so easy to get. It's maybe not that easy, but let's say you get 20,000 GitHub stars. It's so much at top of funnel. All those could be potential customers. Let's ramp this all up, and then you might put out a release and you get 3 interested prospects, and it's like deflating, almost crushing to have that disappointment of the potential is that everyone should want to use it, and you just have this small trickle, right? But that small trickle is just it's gold. It's like a vein of gold to mine. And you never want to take your eyes off anyone that is willing to sign up and go the distance with you. It's like learn everything you can from those customers. Like as CEO, as founder, you want to be in there constantly on a weekly basis, talking to them, finding out what's working, what's not working. You want to manage and really live from that customer's perspective or that small group of customers. And then when you have it so that your product works well for them, that's when you start to scale.
We give that advice a lot, kind of like know your customer and talk to your customer. What did that look like for you in the early days with these early customers? Are you, going to their office? Are you sitting next to them? Are you on a call with them? Tell us a little bit more.
I mean, anything I could do, I did. Mm-hmm. And one of our one of the failure modes that I've had to grapple with and overcome was when we started scaling up, I no longer was doing that. I wasn't taking the first customer call anymore, and the sales team didn't want me there. They wanted to use me on closes and high executive touch points. Like, we'll trot out our CEO like when it's time. There's a couple problems with that. Nobody's a better ambassador for the product and than the founder. Ideally, that's something you definitely hope is true. And I don't get tired of talking about cockroaches, I told you. So that helps. I can talk to an endless number of customers. But when I was moved away from the customer, not only did I think that hurt some of our calls and didn't give me an opportunity necessarily to train folks just by having them watch how I did the pitch and things like that. It also, I think, really hurt me as a founder because nobody has more of an ability to steer the product and pound on the table and insist we've got to build this sort of thing. People are asking for it, and what they're asking for makes sense, and this is a sign of things to come. I wasn't getting that signal, right? So I was getting more and more distant from the customer, and I realized that the single greatest thing you have to do, no matter how the role changes as a founder CEO, is you have to stay curious. And there's nothing more important than staying curious about the customer. You have to understand where they're failing, and you have to watch them, and you have to have that personal relationship.
I love that. It's also really admirable as an engineer that went from engineer to CEO to kind of have that closeness to the customer. I feel like that doesn't come, like, that's not common. It's not a common trait from a lot of the founders that I even myself and others that I've worked with. So I think that's really important advice. Is there any other piece of advice that you would give to founders, kind of based on your multiple experiences that are early, maybe deciding what product to build, really learning from their customer, that maybe you did or you would have done differently?
Well, one piece of advice, we're talking about the -1 to 0 part of the journey. I think people fetishize ideas, the value of ideas. I mean, I hear people, and it happened to me as well, ask for equity based on their contribution to some initial brainstorming.
Oh, wow.
And ideas are not worth the napkins they're written on, that's for sure. Ideas are cheap, and everyone that thinks they have a novel idea is treading old ground, is all I can say. There's no new ideas. But there is always the potential for somebody to really put their belief and intelligence and sweat equity into executing an idea, and that's where the value is. So, boy, whatever kind of wild brainstorming and brilliance that's coming out, in some initial group, and then some people go on and build a company. In 3 years, that initial what felt like the genesis and all of the amazing brilliance, that will seem like the most distant little footnote in terms of the value that had to be created. Don't fetishize ideas. And what that means is when you're going around and you're pitching your idea, don't try to get people to sign NDAs. Don't try to protect your idea as though others are going to steal it or learn from it and leapfrog you or anything like that. Your superpower is belief in what that entails about your ability to execute. And that's what you'll succeed on. By opening up everything that you have in terms of here's where my idea has problems, here's my vision, here's the secret sauce. You want to tell that to as many VCs as you can, especially the best ones, and you want them to challenge you. You want them to say, hey, have you heard about a company? It sounds exactly like what you're doing. That is a very terrible thing to hear, but it will happen. But the great thing is you're probably going to say no, and then they're going to tell you a little bit about it, and then you're going to go home from that meeting and you're going to find out everything you can about that competitor or prospective competitor, and you're going to realize, no, actually, they're doing something different, and they didn't understand what I was doing and what the distinction is, so that would become part of your pitch. Or they're doing something really smart, and that just gave me some ideas, and they're not doing it totally right, and we're going to iterate and evolve what we're doing so that we're actually building something that is a better point in the solution space than what we were originally going to do. But that having somebody, as many people as possible, shed light on your idea, whether it's good, where it's bad, what the larger ecosystem looks like, and whether it will embrace your idea or not, that is invaluable. Because whatever you can do to course correct early is a lot less expensive than whatever you do when you've hired people and you've started building and you got some point and you realize that there's this competitor that's already like 2 years ahead of you. That is not a good place to be, and you hope you don't get there. It's a lot easier not to get there if you're out there talking to people that see hundreds of these kinds of deals. VCs, by the way, have specializations. So if you're building a database, you're going to talk to people that do infrastructure. And man, they know, they've seen every database company in the world come through, and they're smart. I don't ever think VCs are not smart, even though they only spend a little bit of time on a particular idea. The good ones in particular are extremely smart, and they're great pattern matchers. So you should leverage that. Talk to people. Talk to anyone that will listen. In fact, talk to your potential competitors. Like, especially if they're a little bit more established. We talked to the people at FoundationDB, and that was a great conversation to have before they got bought by Apple. We talked to the people at MemSQL, which is called Single Store now. They brought us into their office. They were way further ahead than we were, and they gave us a lot of downloads on things. It was super helpful, and we're always willing to talk to anyone as well. So don't be afraid. Get out there, be curious, and learn, and just realize that no matter how deflating it is to see some potential competition that might be outclassing you in some way, that is an essential part of the journey, and it's a huge opportunity to learn.
That was, you answered so many questions in one. And I want to make sure there's time for folks in the audience who I think are itching to ask some questions. But I think one thing that's on my mind, this is, based on your experience starting multiple companies, is there anything that you feel second-time founders do better that first-time founders could easily learn and maybe should think about?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you a personal anecdote. You wanted me to share things I never shared before. I'm sure I've shared this, so bear with me. But culture is not something that you should take for granted. When we started Viewfinder, Peter and I were both coming from a decade at Google, and then Ben joined us there. So he was there maybe 7 years at Google. And we had a couple other co-founders. We just assumed we'd have a Google-like culture. It'd be like, exceptional engineering ethos, and everyone, can do, people working really well together. It's very friendly. We have, great opportunity for, just collegial collaboration. And that just did not happen. We worked really hard. Everyone was in the office, but when it wasn't quite working, people started getting bickery, and nobody really did things outside of the office, but we worked really late. Whew. By the time we sold to Square, it was not a fun place to work, to put it mildly. But those three founders of Cockroach, we maintained very, very good ties. But there were some schisms in the company that were difficult to deal with. So when we went to Square had a good culture too, and we realized, okay, we just did this wrong. Something we did wrong here. And when we decided to make Cockroach into a company, before we incorporated or really decided this is what we're going to do, we said, if we're going to do this, with a interest from the VCs and all this stuff, but still, if we are going to do this, we are going to write a manifesto on culture, because we are not going to work at a company that felt like Viewfinder did when things, a year in, let's say. And so we wrote up a list of the things that we would do. What would we do weekly? What would we do monthly? What would we do quarterly? How do we? It was kind of thinking back, what did Google do when it was a small company? When Peter and I and Ben joined, it was about 350 people. And Google did amazing stuff. They were constantly bringing people together. People hung out after work. They had these thank God it's Friday things where people boozed a little bit, and people go bowling, and they had these all kinds of trips. They had this ski trip. I can tell you some funny stories about those early ski trips at Google. Wow, I don't think they have quite as much fun there as they used to. But those lessons were not made into practical wisdom in how to start a company, even though we lived those things for 10 years. Because Google maintained that. They were very conscientious and intentional about their culture. And so we just stumbled into a dead end by not focusing on it. When we set out the things that we were going to do, and one of them was, it was a small team, it was easy, everyone was in New York. We're going to have a dinner every single week together, one night. I think it was Tuesday night. And that was really impactful. Just having dinner, having drinks, it's on the investor's bill, It's great. Why wouldn't you do that? You've got 5 people or 10 people or whatever. You can have these, just explore all the restaurants in New York. But that was instrumental, I'd say, in forging great early culture at the company. And then we also, every quarter, or maybe twice a year, I can't remember what it was in the early days, but we went on these company trips. Like we went down to the Dominican Republic, and we all just sat around the pool. A lot of people on their laptops and things, but we'd be swimming, and at night, having little parties and whatever, bonfires. Super cool. Like that's how you actually do something that is critical when you use the word culture, which is you want to build human relationships, create these bonds that actually will hold people in each other's esteem to an extent, because a friendship is a very powerful thing, and not everything goes according to how you want it to go in a company, and those human relationships are what keep it from all becoming transactional and mercenary.
That was a beautiful answer. I think that having lived what the opposite extreme of that with Viewfinder, I feel like you clearly ingrained such a fantastic culture. And I also often say culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think that's pretty clear here in this example.
I think Napoleon said, what was it? Morale is to material as 3 to 1, something like that.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. This was amazing. Thank you everyone for coming out, and thank you, Spencer, for making the time. We really appreciate it.